We're live.
All right. YouTube bonus. So, Josh, I broke a chain. It's not a chain from our sponsor, Shimano. So there's good news there. Which
How many watts were you pushing?
Actually, it didn't snap on me under power. I was climbing, and I could hear it start to click, and I thought maybe my derailleur cable was loose or old or whatever. When I got to the top of the climb, I took a closer examination. I noticed one link was skipping around. I'm like, uh-oh, and I took a closer look again and noticed that the link, and I don't know, you probably can't see this on the camera very well. This is an outer plate. Had snapped, right? Or it broke.
Oh, look at
break.
that, yeah.
Yeah, so... And so the only thing that got me, I mean, geez, how did this happen? I'd taken really good care of this chain. I wipe it down all the time. It is a super secret drip chain. In other words, it had been dunked in the lube twice. In fact, I've done 2 jobs on it. It's over a year old. I checked it when I got home. It's not worn out, but this outer plate broke. Right. Unfortunately, I threw the rest of the chain out because I got so mad at it. I just chucked it. I still have some of the clip. This is the new section I clipped on. Anyhow, the thing that got me thinking about, like, what happened here? Like, is this embrittlement? Could this be embrittlement? So the one thing I do when I clean my chains, right, with our new chains, again, it's the protocol that you guys have laid out, right, with the spirits and then the alcohol wash at the end. But I do blow the chain, right? Now, the problem we run into is, right, when we get mixed water with mineral spirits, we can get embrittlement. Is that why you folks have say no, when you have a used chain, don't use mineral spirits because you can get embrittlement? That's generally the idea.
No, the embrittlement is typically more when you have a solvent, like a water-based solvent that you're soaking in for a long period of time, and it can go from, like, typically they start basic, and if they start to go towards, like, we've talked about Simple Green, it's the worst at this, goes from basic towards acid, and you've got this, like, these free hydrogens, essentially. And it's the hydrogens that are, like, causing the embrittlement, which is why we call it hydrogen embrittlement. And so you don't get that with mineral spirits or with an acetone. What happens, though, if you put a chain that's wet in mineral spirits, the water will not absorb into the mineral spirit at all, and it will trap it as like a bubble at the surface, and then you'll get this, like, hyper concentrated kind of rusting action of that water that's trapped in there. And so that's why, the mineral spirit is a nonpolar solvent, which is, like the grease is nonpolar, right? Which is why water doesn't affect it. Water's polar. And so that's why the trend is, like, you're trying to start with a nonpolar that will soften and absorb the grease, and then you move towards a polar solvent that will ultimately allow you to wash with water, or you end up with, like, an acetone that'll flash away. So yeah, I mean, it's hard, obviously impossible to say without a microscope and a bunch of other work on it, like what really caused that.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah,
one thing I do is I take my compressor, and when I'm cleaning my chain, I do cycles, right? I do the mineral spirits, I pull it out, and I blast it with the compressed air. Now, you can have water in your compressor, right? And it can get sprayed onto the chain. I was just wondering if that might be an issue.
I doubt it. It would be hard for me to think of that, because I think even then, if you're going from there. Now there's water present, and then you go into, like, a denatured alcohol or even any alcohol or an acetone. Those are polar. The water's going to go away quickly. So I would say unlikely.
Yeah, because I'll do that cycle like 2 or 3 times depending on the brand of chain. In other words, I'll mineral spirits out, blast with air, back in mineral spirits, out, blast with air until I feel like I've got it clean. Then I flash it in acetone or denatured alcohol, then dry. Right, then into the wax or into the whatever chain treatment I'm using. And I thought, well, maybe I'm introducing water with the blasted air.
Yeah, I don't see that being the thing. I don't. Okay. Although I do have to say,
probably just a cheap chain then.
I'm going off script here, but we're totally going to mess that up for you in the future with a new product.
Okay, that's fine.
That's all I'll say about that. Well, I'll say that, and
come on.
I'll say 10 minutes or less.
Oh man.
Which
Okay.
I think for
I'm
Hottie
going to
that
stop recording, and you're going to tell us when
that may ruin Hottie's Friday. Like Hottie's Friday is like 3-4 hours of chain cleaning.
Hottie's spa.
We're gonna blow it
is
all
going
up
to
with
become a Hottie's drive-through spa.
Here's what I've started to do. I walk down the streets. I have a neighbor, and I walk down the street, and I walk right up to his bike, which is hanging on his bike rack, and I start looking down at his chain and turning it backwards and noticing all the grease. He comes out and goes, "Is there anything wrong with my bike?" I said, "Yeah, your chain looks like hell. Bring your bike over." And we brought his bike over, and I dropped the chain and cleaned it all and applied Synergetic on it and sent him on his way. And then he went and got a new chain, and I gave him the whole spa treatment afterwards.
Oh, my.
And he gave me a Robex card, which was very nice.
That's nice. But
Worked out for everyone.
Did you guys see the Ollie at GCN at the Giro opening?
Yeah.
Stage of the Giro.
No.
He's like naming and shaming for who's waxing and who's not. It was great.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well,
that's good stuff. Good stuff.
Probably just a cheap chain. I mean, it probably just broke in the end. I'm guessing so. But, God, I've just never broken one, so I was a little startled.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
it's
have such a hard one to know.
Yeah, right.
Because you think, like, they're so complicated, like we've talked about before in these, like, there's so many parts in a chain that I'm truly deeply amazed that we don't break them way, way more often than we do.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah, they're pretty amazing what they do. So, anyhow. Okay, so Fatty is on the clock here. By the way, there's a new
No,
little
I'm okay.
Okay. So we got a new
I was just going to say that I have a post-episode bonus question that I want to ask.
Okay.
Mine is also personal, but, Hottie somehow managed to jump the line. I don't think this is going to be the last time he does it in this episode.
No, I'm not. My question is way down at the end of the show today. I've been a good boy.
Well, you just had your question. You did.
Well, for the YouTube. Not for the audio portion of the show. I guess that's my focus.
YouTube is where it's at.
We're separating them now.
Splitting hairs. That is a marginally.
Fatty,
that is a marginal difference.
It was your idea to record all this nonsense before. I was like, wait, time out. Before we start the show, I have 800 questions for Josh. So.
I'm not opposed to you jumping the line. I just want people to know that you jumped the line.
Look, I have access to this mind once a month, maybe, and I want to take full advantage. If I worked there like Travis, I'd be, he'd probably kick me out every day. Like, Hottie, get the hell out of here with your goddamn questions. Get to work. Go to boxing or fixing pumps or whatever. This is it, Fatty. This is all I've got.
This is my social life, man.
No, this is my chain life.
Sounding increasingly sad. I think we should go to the show.
Okay, there is a new way to kick off the show, too. For the audio side. Sorry, YouTube.
Okay.
So my idea is that let's start with a question right away, Josh, and we'll try to make the answer as short as possible. That's what that first question is. So it's like a cold open, what they call a cold open. So we're going to do a cold open.
Do you know how much I talk?
Well,
as short as possible, like 10 minutes.
To the theme until like 40 minutes in.
It's like...
This will be a great exercise for you then.
Okay.
Can you answer this question in 30 seconds or less?
30 seconds
no.
or less. Yeah, probably. It depends. How about that?
Yes,
that's
pretty short.
You must commit.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start recording in Audition.
Right. Oh, you are? Okay.
I am recording in Audition now. Things are getting serious when we start recording in Audition, man.
Oh, man. I will, hold on, let me kick off. I'm in Audacity.
Audacious.
Skip, okay.
All
right, I'm recording in Audacity.
Okay, me too. I mean, in Audition for me. Okay, this is Ask Josh Anything number 29 with a whole new format. in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All righty. Okay. This is the Marginal Gains Podcast. Ask Josh Anything, number 29. And a question right out of the box for Chief Marginal Gainer and SILCA CEO Josh Portner. A Rule 105 question from Tom. Is a 700 by 38 tire on a 40 millimeter wide rim, that's external width, more aerodynamic than a 28 tire set up on a rim with an external width of 27 millimeters? Or does the frontal area of the 38 negate the rule of 105 when compared to the 28? Josh, what say you?
I'll say no and then yes. Since you gave me 5 seconds. Rule of 105 is really all about aero performance with yaw. So low yaw, your wider tire, wider rim is going to be slower, absolutely. Your narrower one will be faster because it just has less frontal area. And then with yaw, the 38 on the 40 will do better probably at everything above, I don't know, call it 2.5 degrees or 5 degrees if you're lucky. The 28 tire on the 27 rim will really start to break down beyond 5 for sure, and beyond 7.5. It's probably like having no aero rim at all because the flow's so tire dominated. So it's a little bit of an it depends answer, but there you go. Less than 30 seconds. Look at me.
I cannot believe it. That is impressive.
I know.
It's a new record, everyone. The Marginal Gains podcast is presented, of course, by SILCA, Heritage Pumps, Wax Chains, Aero Socks, Bike Cleaning Products, and more. I'm Eldon Nelson, also known as Fatty. And as usual, Hottie has already managed to outmaneuver me and get in his question and negating my plan to jump line this episode.
That wasn't my question. That was Tom's question that went up first. I yield the floor. I'm Michael Houghton, Hottie the Most. Hey, guys, I made it to Seattle and saw something in the Shimano booth that kind of blew my mind. Now, everyone knows Shimano has electronic shifting, DI2. Well, Shimano has a pretty cool iteration of their electronic shifting, and it's on their mountain e-bike side, where they now have a 12-speed XT DI2 group that does automatic shifting. This group can be programmed to shift based on cadence and effort, so all the rider has to do is pedal. And speaking of pedaling, this group will shift even when the rider is not pedaling. I got on the bike equipped with this group, and I'll have to say it was very impressive. Shimano is a supporter of this show, and to check out the electronic automatic transmission for e-bike, go to bike.shimano.com.
Let's go ahead and start this show in familiar territory, finding clever ways to be aero. Here's what Josh Spencer from Fort Wayne asks in the Marginal Gains podcast.cc comments. He says, I am a wannabe triathlete and I'm doing my best to buy speed wherever possible. Last year during the sub-7, sub-8 triathlon event, which as you know included both Dowsett and Bigham, I noticed the guys were using a dual rear aero bottle cage setup to replicate a fairing. Since that time, I've seen other triathletes using variations on this setup where the size and positioning from the saddle seems more likely to be there for aero benefits rather than hydration purposes. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the potential aero gains from fairings, specifically if bigger is better, and how far you see this trend going.
Oh, wow. That's a good one. I would say if the fairing is in the right location, bigger is generally better. The key from everything I've ever done testing those behind the seat bottles is that they can be really specific to rider. I think hip width, size of your legs, the kind of arch of your back. Some riders definitely do better with those a little higher than you would think. And I would say the majority of riders probably do better with those bottles lower. But that height sensitivity is key. So, I've put that setup on a bike in the tunnel before and had it be actually worse than not being there. So it's a hard one for me to really make a suggestion on, in that the likelihood of it being a penalty is low, but I have definitely seen it be an absolute penalty. If you don't have access to a tunnel or aren't doing your own, chung testing, I would say you're probably better to err on the low side rather than the high. And then I know there's some products out there that, and I don't know the names or the brands of them, but aren't even just the bottles, but have almost kind of like an integrated seat bag, air quotes for the for the non YouTube side of this this channel is sort of a seat bag integrated, which kind of smooths the airflow and makes it a little bit more aero looking. So that'd be my recommendation there.
Okay, on to tire inserts and tire pressure. Tire inserts are becoming increasingly popular as the technology matures, and we're starting to get questions about tire pressures with tire inserts. A listener from Boston had this question for us, sent to us by text, in fact, 317-343-4506. He asked, when using tire inserts, they are effectively reducing the internal volume inside the tire. That is to say, 20 psi with inserts is not the same as 20 psi without them on the same tires. How do we account for this when using something like the SILCA tire pressure calculator?
Ooh, that's a good question, and actually based on a not true assumption. So 20 psi with inserts is exactly the same as 20 psi without inserts. I think the assumption there comes from the industry's tendency to talk about these tires based on internal volume. And I'm not sure where exactly that got started, but people love to talk about, more volume equals more stiffness equals more, all that stuff. Really what it's all about is casing tension. And casing tension is purely a function of the pressure on the casing or the pressure differential inside of the casing to the outside of the casing and the diameter of the casing itself. So, you think of the simplest form of casing tension is like one of those propane tanks you see, on the side of the road, next to a building that's using chemicals or whatever, one of those, big pressure tanks. If you put something physical in the middle of that and it's at 1,000 psi, and now it's, it's full of golf balls and 1,000 psi, it's the same casing tension. Yeah. Think not in terms of volume, but really it's just air pressure times effective diameter. It's more complicated than that. But the other way to look at that is a lot of the modern tire inserts are closed cell foam that has some sort of internal pressure equivalent, right? The stiffness of the foam plus the air trapped in the closed cells. And as you put the external pressure on it, it will shrink down until those pressures are equal, or there's an equivalence there. And so that's kind of another way to think of it is, that shrunken down insert is going to be at some roughly 20 psi equivalent to the air around it, all said and done. So there you go. Run your calculation, use that pressure.
All right. So I don't need to change anything when I use the tire pressure calculator and start using inserts, is what I'm hearing.
Correct. Yeah,
All
no
right.
changes.
Okay. We're going to stay on that tire pressure topic for a minute. We've got a great question. Another one coming in by text, 317-343-4506, which is actually now one of the 4 phone numbers that I have memorized. After 29 episodes, I finally know this. I can say it. I can say it without looking at it. So Rob from Columbia, South Carolina, has an interesting question about conflicting tire pressure recommendations, and he's got sort of a related follow-up on hookless rims. Here's what he says. I recently bought a set of Envy's SES 4.5 wheels, which are hookless. I put Conti 5000 STR tubeless tires on there that measure out to about 30 millimeters once mounted. Herein lies the question. On the SILCA tire pressure calculator for my weight, etc., it recommends about 68 psi. On Envy's website, it recommends about 55 psi. Why is there such a large gap between these two different recommendations? It seems that hookless tend to run even lower pressure than your typical hooked rim. And then he has a bonus question. Why is the max pressure so low on hookless? Are they afraid the tire might pop off the rim or what?
To answer the last question, yes. They are afraid the tire might pop off. And this, I think we've covered it here a little bit before, but what Envy and all of the hookless rim makers are kind of forced into here is based on what I've termed a real intellectual laziness by the ISO ETRTO committees around this topic, where they pretty much put a fixed pressure limit on hookless rims of 72 psi, I think it is, without really going into any detail on specifics related to tire width, measured tire width, any of that stuff. And so kind of by rule, a company like Envy has to say 70, 72 psi max for this rim. And so now when it comes to calculating different pressures for different rider weights, they're in a bit of a corner, in that everything really has to start at, my heaviest rider on my smoothest surface has to have an answer of 72. So everyone else has to be less than that. And so, it's really forced the manufacturers of these style of rims to sort of, from what I've seen, slide their scale downward so that you can always have this max pressure for your max rider situation of 72. The thing to remember with the SILCA tire pressure calculator is that, it's based on actual calculations done on actual tires in the real world with real riders. A good bit of it has actually been done with hookless now, but it pays no attention to what the tire or the rim recommendation is. So even if we were testing in the field and I found that 75 psi was the fastest option on this hookless rim, that's the number that goes into the database that the calculator drives from. And so, my recommendation there would be, use the calculator, get your number. If the number is over the 72 or whatever max pressure is on your rim, then that is generally a sign that you just need a bigger tire for the situation that you're riding. But yeah, this is a real challenge at the moment for the industry, and I think it really points to how important and yet tricky these standards are. That I think in the standards meeting, and I've sat through a million of them, I think they were making what they felt was the safest choice. Like, hey, let's just put a ceiling on this of this number, and we can be confident that tires aren't going to blow off at this number. But because all of the other work wasn't done, you're now forcing all the companies into some really challenging communication scenarios, right? Because if you went to, to a company's website and no matter what you punched in, it was telling you 72 psi was your optimal pressure, you wouldn't believe that, and you would be right to not believe that. So it really forces them to kind of slide the scale and create some new numbers that are honestly, probably based. I know we know Envy quite well. We do a lot of work with them. I'm assuming if you ask them, they would say, well, we're biasing our numbers for comfort and grip relative to, the ETRTO pressure limitations. Whereas the SILCA calculator is really calculating around optimal rolling resistance based on historical data, and because we don't make any of the tires or the rims involved, we just throw all the rules out the window and say we don't care what the answer is. Here's the right answer, and then it's really up to you to kind of make the best decision with the right answer. Yeah,
and your memory is great there, Josh. ETRTO standard is 72.5 psi on a hookless road rim. That is the standard.
Does this put you in any kind of liability question, Josh? I mean, if you recommend a number that is higher than the maximum recommended pressure, is that an issue?
No, I mean, so we say, never exceed the max pressure that your tire or rim manufacturer says. And also, we don't, in our calculator, we don't ask the question hooked or hookless because it doesn't, from the tire rolling perspective, it doesn't matter. And so, it really, but it does speak certainly to the extreme complexity, around these issues that have arisen again because I think they only went part way in creating their side of that standard.
Right. Yeah. But as always, of course, there's always the caveat emptor, the warning, right? You let the buyer beware. Always do your own math. Make sure you don't do anything outrageous.
Yeah, and never violate. What what the product says not to violate, right? We we hope that is obvious, and we state that on our calculator. It should be obvious.
Yep.
But the other way to look at that, like I said, is if our calculator is telling you a pressure that's higher than either the tire or the rim allows for, what that's really telling you is that you're on too small of a tire, and you need to go up.
Yeah, I think that's really the headline.
So yeah,
I
wonder, honestly, that's not just for safety; that's for performance as well.
I heard some ladies in the Paris-Roubaix this year went back to tubulars because they couldn't run their tubeless tires low enough for fear that the lower pressure would create some type of blow-off too. That's the other end of the spectrum here, right, Josh? That running too low of a pressure with a tubeless tire can also present problems.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we see this a lot in cyclocross, right? There's a lot of worry and risk of burping the tires. And I think, for me, that's where the tire inserts can become a real game changer. And again, like I think we talked about in a previous episode, the modern, insert that sits down in the tire well and kind of inflates when the tire deflates, not the more like mountain bike downhill, giant rectangular cross section tire insert. But something like the Vittoria. Can't remember what their brand name is for that product, but the Vittoria green insert, a lot of the pro teams use those, and those can really help with prevent burping as well as prevent rim damage, because they shrink, but they don't shrink below the level of the bead in most rims, and so that it's a nice extra little bit of insurance there.
Sure.
For the riders. And honestly, and a little bit sadly, past that, I think most everybody knows that's the right answer. And then you get into teams that either don't want to do that work, or have no access to product like that, and maybe no funds to buy products like that off sponsorship. And so then they have to find other solutions.
Okay, let's transition to drivetrain now. We've got a couple of chain-related questions coming up, and we actually got this next one from New Mexico. Gene from New Mexico asks, I just made the change, that is, to a wax chain lube using the SILCA Super Secret Hot Wax. He says, when I was prepping the drive chain, I noticed that the Ultegra 10-speed guide pulleys did not spin freely. He says his understanding is that this is due to bushings instead of bearings being in those guide pulleys. Does this have a performance effect, he asked? He says he wasn't sure where to turn, and then thought maybe this would be a good question for Josh and the Marginal gang.
So before Josh answers the question here, I want to ask, how is it possible that until this point we have not been calling ourselves the Marginal gang?
We need a gang sign. I'm trying here. Oh, there's the M, and this would be the G.
Yes, okay. Let's have 3 middle-aged white guys have a gang sign.
Yeah,
that would be fantastic.
we need some colors. Wow,
I'm in LA.
Yeah.
But yeah, I actually love this question because there is a twist. I thought it was going to be a wax question. It's actually more of a, what is my derailleur pulley costing me question.
Yeah, so that's a good one. So it has been a long time since I've looked at anything 10-speed, I'm going to be honest. And I'm not positive what's in there. I know the modern 12-speed stuff, they've gone to bearings. But the overall answer here really is that, I think everybody sees these Instagram videos and, you flick the pulley and it spins for 2 minutes and, all that stuff. The reality is those pulleys all are sealed bearings that have no seals and no grease. And so, what they're selling you is this amazing, like, wow, look how free that thing spins. But, even an average clean bushing will spin probably half or 2/3 as long. And even a, cheap Target skateboard bearing could probably have about the same effect. I mean, it is a bit, I don't want to poke anybody in the eye, but it is a bit of a circus trick. Doing what companies that sell those products do, and they all do it. And I can't blame them, because if I sold that product, I would do it too. It's become the expectation. the reality is you put some grease in that bearing and it now probably stops spinning in like 1 revolution or 2. And you put seals on that bearing, like actual contact seals, and it probably spins, you flick it and it spins half a rotation. And then it gets into what brand you have. A lot of the ceramic pulleys on the market today feel the way they feel because they use non-contact seals and really thin grease, which is why a lot of them have things in their recommendations in their instructions that say things like, disassemble, clean, and relubricate after every ride in the rain. Because none of us read the instructions, we don't realize that that's the case. So I'm not sure if your Ultegra 10-speed guide pulley is a bushing or a bearing. But what I would say is it probably does not spin freely because it has some sort of seal. Honestly, being a pulley, they get dirty 1 ride, 2 rides. And so it's probably also not spinning freely because it's dirty and there's gunk in there. Lubricant drips down in there. Stuff sticks to that. Even with wax, you get little wax flakes will flake off into the shield that covers the bearing or the bushing, and potentially gum things up a little bit. So, I would pull it apart, give it a real good clean, give it a little bit of lube on the inside if it's a bushing, or flush it and a little bit of thin grease in there if it's a bearing. And the performance effect is going to be incredibly, incredibly small. We're seeing the best aftermarket oversized pulley systems are saving something on the order of like 1.8 watts over the stock system, right? And that's a combination of ceramic bearings, non-contact seals, thinner greases, and the oversized bit of the pulling. So if you start to break that down, what's this pulley versus that pulley, it's almost certainly less than 1 watt. And what you're really feeling when you see, again, unless it's gritty or nasty in there and clean it, then you'll fix it. But a lot of what you're really seeing there is static versus dynamic friction, right? That it's the friction to get something going is higher than the friction to keep it going. And so with anything that's got any sort of seal or grease in there, you're going to get a similar effect to this. And honestly, you could go buy the $1,800 oversized pulley system, and by the time you put a little bit of grease in and the seals on it, it will do essentially the same thing. Yeah. So clean it, you'll be in good shape.
Man, they look good. Man, those look cool, don't they? Until you bash one on a rock on your mountain bike, and then oh my God.
But sometimes you're just buying that placebo effect, but we love the placebo effect, right?
Hey, look,
does look good.
If I was a professional time trialist, I would want that 1.5 watts, right? I get that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get it when I see it on a pro tour bike. On a mountain bike, on somebody who's not riding for a living, I go, okay, all right, your money.
All right. Okay, everyone, settle in. Next couple of questions are, in fact, really waxing your chain related. We may, in fact, spend almost as much time on this topic as we might on, say, hop bifurcation in F1 cars, but probably not. But these are actually bike-related questions. Let's start with this voicemail we got on the Marginal Gains hotline, and that number, of course, is 317-343-4506.
Oh, I guess we could have loaded them in the Riverside, so the YouTubers
Hey guys,
can...
I love the podcast. This is Bill from Riverview, Florida. Now, despite only owning a BMX race bike, I'm infatuated, well, kind of like obsessed with maintenance on all my friends' chains. So my question is, if someone always has access to like a freshly immersed wax chain, is there any biking discipline or situation where using a wax chain isn't the best option? Can't wait to hear your response. Thanks.
All right, Josh. When is a wax chain a bad idea?
And no, for our quickest answer ever. The only time that an immersion wax chain is not the best option is like ultra distance type events, and even then, I would argue that your best option is to start with an immersion wax chain and then add a wet lube over that as you need it to get through the rest of your event. And we have actually seen quite a few athletes do this. If you're pit stopping in an ultra endurance event, swap the chain, right? Go from, put a brand new fresh immersion of wax chain on there to continue on. So yeah, I would say it's really one of the few areas of our sport that you can point to something and say, wow, it's the fastest, quietest, longest lasting, lowest wearing. I mean, there's really no negative to it. It's like getting your tire pressure just right. Everything is better. There's really no trade-off other than, it will start to break down past 300, 400 kilometers or so.
So I have a follow-up question. Yeah. How fast can you fast swap a chain? I mean, a super fast race mechanic, how fast can you change a chain? Or have you seen a chain changed?
Oh yeah, I mean we've even done it for athletes. I'd say 10, 15 seconds.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, I always thought of how fast you can change a tire as sort of the gold standard of mechanics working fast and elegant, doing something in 10 seconds that I take at least 7 minutes to do. But a chain in that short of time, that would be impressive. I would love to see that.
Yeah. No, it's super fast. And I'll say that the other thing the wax has going for it, when the chain is recently waxed, it's got that little bit of stiffness to it, and that actually makes feeding it through the rear derailleur like 10 times faster.
That's
right?
True.
I feel like the biggest pain in the butt of putting a new chain on is feeding it through the derailleur, and you're trying to get it behind those little tabs and over the pulleys, and it's floppy and it keeps wanting to fall out. With a freshly waxed chain, it's got just enough stiffness to it that you can kind of make a straight section of it and then just thread it right through and on. I'd say 15 seconds tops.
I want a video. I really want to see.
Stage a race. We need a chain installation race, I think. Little throwdown with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Good pit stop style. I like it.
Yeah.
I like
Okay,
it.
we're going to continue to try to poke holes in the wax chain thing here. And we're going to start with Vince in Texas, who has an interesting dilemma here with the heat of Texas.
Hey, this is Vince in Texas, and I have a question about running wax in the heat. I've been waxing my chains on my road and gravel bikes for a few years now. One thing I've noticed here in Texas is on a hot day, the wax gets soft. It starts to get shiny there on the chain. I'm using the SILCA wax. And it's enough that it does start to attract dirt. And a couple hours into a gravel race, I'll get that grindy sound I used to get when I was running a traditional lubricant. For example, this last gravel locos here in Hyco, Texas, it was 100 degrees, and 4 hours in, my chain was making noise like it used to with regular oil. Is there anything that can be done, or is there formulas that are specific for high heat like we have here in Texas, so I can get all the advantages of wax? Thanks, guys. Rock on.
So we'll get to that dust question in a second, Josh, about the noise. But what about the melting problem he's having?
Yeah. I mean, this is a tough one, and I think in an ideal world, you probably would have maybe two formulations, like a hot weather and a less hot weather formulation. Most of the wax products in the market right now have melting points somewhere in the 150 range. There are, and that's Fahrenheit, there are products out there that go much closer to 200. And I'd say we're recently familiar with this because we've actually developed or we have some top tier shifter go-kart racers who are moving to wax, and we've actually developed a formula for one of them that's it's a graphene and tungsten loaded high temperature wax for karting, and it has a much hotter 200 Fahrenheit or so melt point, because it's just much harder and much hotter in there, and because the friction is so high that the chain actually gets hot in a go-kart type application. So yeah, I would say, at the Formula One level of cycling, there starts to be some sense around this, and I think you probably start to get a little bit like what we have in cross-country skiing, where you have temperature sensitivities. Certainly the size of the market and where we are in the cycling industry now, I think that gets a little bit hard. Like, oh, it's hot today, I've got to take my wax out of my crock pot and change some things, or change to a new wax. I think that gets to be a little bit of a tough sell. What I will say is, us and I think a couple other companies, from what I've seen, products coming into the market, I will say that the melt points of waxes are going up. I mean, the stuff SILCA is shipping today is different than what it was shipping 6 months or a year ago, and a lot of that's based on learnings we've had in terms of both longevity, but also handling the pressure inside the chain. That's pushing that up a little bit. Without the risk is that if you just go to higher melt temp waxes, the waxes are more brittle at room temperature, and then they flake off much faster, and so the life expectancy comes down. If you go to softer waxes, the single application life expectancy goes up, but then the temperature at which they get sticky and stuff sticks to them also comes down by quite a bit. And so this is, you can see this in the market today with some of the drip wax products. If you follow Friction Facts, the Effetto Mariposa's sunflower wax is now beats Super Secret in terms of single application longevity, and kind of I can't even remember the number, but I think they're 20% better than us or whatever by the end of block 6. And a lot of that is it stays in the chain a little bit longer. The downside of that is, to do it's a much stickier wax that attracts and then holds a lot more dirt. And so one of the things that, I think companies like us, and clearly them, and I think Ceramic Speed just reformulated all their stuff, and they're trying to diversify into different categories of wax product. It's really sort of where do you put yourself on the continuum, and then how do you message that to the consumer in a way that it doesn't just seem like a total pain in the ass, right? If you had 3 lubes that you have to use at different temperatures, nobody wants that. Or invariably you're going to find yourself always out on the right one. And so, I know we certainly spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's that right blend that, it's going to still work really well on that 110-degree day, but it's also not going to require that you completely strip and rewax your drivetrain on a 72-degree day. Because as you see with a lot of these, like our go-kart wax, that stuff, you can't break it free with your hands, and it does not work on a cool day on a bicycle because it's just too stiff. Yeah. So I would say it's a balancing act. I would say the good news, or the other way to look at it, and you can certainly reference Zero Friction's sort of experience here, hot wax that's hot and shiny that attracts dirt is still giving you far superior performance to a wet lubricant or any other type of lubricant, in that it's buying you, maybe it starts to get grindy after 4 hours, 3 hours, but it's saving you all of the friction and the grindy bits for the first 3 hours. Which is something that you're getting essentially immediately with like a factory grease chain or a wet lubed chain.
Mm-hmm. Well, Vince mentioned noise, and squeaky chains are a real annoyance. This is something that happens in the Southwest a lot, where a chain that's recently been waxed and not melted, it doesn't get so hot that the wax melts, but just a regular wax chain. You're riding fire roads like I do around here. In fact, we've noticed this recently. And you've been riding 2 or 3 hours, or you do successive rides that total 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and you start hearing the chain, or you're hearing something. And it's not grinding, but it's like that squeaking noise coming from your drivetrain. Yep. And we all know what that is, right? That the chain starts making noise after the plates have shed their wax. You still have wax deep down, but the plates have shed their wax, and those plates are moving over the largest cogs of your cassette. You might have an angle to that chain too. Maybe you're in a climbing gear. You have dust on that cassette, and then you have this squeaking noise. Me and my fellow waxers encounter this all the time here in Southern California. I've heard about it, obviously, in Texas, Arizona. And the solution is to, like, wipe your chain in cogs with a dry rag, but mid-ride, that can be a real pain, and the noise just comes back before the ride's even done. And short of re-waxing before every dusty ride, off-roaders in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado would like to know what can be done to prevent that squeak from kind of coming up, in between wax treatments. I checked in with Josh, with Adam down at Zero Friction Cycling on this. He's in Australia. Obviously, he rides in dusty conditions. Asked him what he thought about all this, if he'd come up with any recent solutions, because you and I have talked about this problem before, and I've talked about it with him too. I just want to see if there's anything new on the horizon. He confirmed what we talked about before here about how it happens. He figures it's about a 2 to 5 watt loss over your baseline, over your freshly waxed chain. That squeak is. Not to mention the psychological effect, right? I mean, a quiet drivetrain is a mental marginal gain as well. Adam says there's a few things you can do with, like, chain line, like maybe you could put a smaller, front ring on, which helps keep you out of those large cogs, which would reduce chain angle. Okay, yeah, that could work, but why have the big cogs, right? If you can't use them, right? Or you could put a non-boost ring on your boost setup. Again, that'll put you in a better chain line with those largest cogs. But again, you're kind of just working around, right? That's kind of a hack more than a solution. On the lube side, Adam suggested one thing you can do is, like, work in your wax chain for 30 minutes, then add a wax-based lube over the top of that, right? So you kind of make room for the wax-based lube by working in the wax a little bit. Again, kind of a lot to do to keep noise at bay, right? Then we started thinking about, well, what if there was some type of anti-static product out there, like from SILCA, right? They can maybe shed dust or keep dust from sticking all together. So, Josh, is there a possibility that we could prevent dust from gathering on cogs, maybe with some type of application of an anti-static product? I'm thinking dryer cloths. That seems kind of silly, but have you given this any thought about how we can maybe keep dust from collecting in the first place?
Wipe your chain down with Bounce.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. It's just funny. I mean, we've actually for some hour record and then world tour time trial type stuff, we have played around quite a bit with high velocity spray applied tungsten disulfide, where essentially you're just high pressure impinging the metal with tungsten disulfide platelets, and they essentially embed in the metal and make it super, super slippery. And one of the side effects is it does actually seem like it gets less dirty. We've played around a little bit with our own graphene wax for your frame. You can use that that product on, well, the graphene and the cleaner wax with the silicon dioxide. Those both theoretically reduce the ability of particles and dust and dirt to stick to the metal surfaces. But it really, the challenge here, like you said, that the wax is still in the chain where you want it, but the squeaking is coming from the side plates rubbing against each other when cross-chaining, right? Or when there's some, beyond some level of cross-chaining. And I mean, really the only way to get that quieted down is to get a little bit of lube in there. And I would recommend the synergetic type oil lube. It will make the system dirty, but it essentially you're quieting down the annoyance. And you probably are, taking back 1 or 2 of those 2 to 5 watts that have been lost. I think the thing to remember, and we have this debate all the time, people say, it doesn't, wax doesn't work past, so many hours or so many miles. And the difference to think about is, like if you have wet lube, it's getting worse from minute 1. Right. So, after an hour, it's half a watt less efficient. After 2 hours, it's, 1 watt less efficient, or, depending on how dirty it is, it's continually getting worse. And with wax, you have more of what Adam talks about as this sort of like jump point, right? Where it's really, really good. And then all of a sudden it's not anymore. And so it's almost, you think of it as like you get this beautiful, amazing, super low friction, and then suddenly you get a jump, or almost like a stair step in frictional increase. And at that point, you could actually add a wet lube over top of it, to knock that back down. And now you're just living in that wet lube regime that, is probably equivalent to wet lube after, 30 minutes or 1 hour, more so than it would be equivalent to wet lube after 4 hours, right? Because wet lube, the longer you ride in those conditions, the worse and worse it gets. The upside of wet lube, and I think this is where people's mental models break down a little bit, is, they think, oh, well, but I can't hear it, right, so it's working well or it's working great. And, because it's not making noise doesn't mean it's low friction, and also doesn't mean that it's not eating away the chain. It's a little bit like the riding in the rain. People say, oh, wax doesn't work in the rain, wet lube works great in the rain. Well, the reality is the wax is better in the rain for however many hours until it's not. Whereas the wet lube is never really good in the rain. It's just not making itself known. It's it's kind of like with your kids, right? Like you can have you joke about like the two kinds of like kids misbehaving, right? The quiet ones and the loud ones. And just because your kid is quietly misbehaving does not mean that they're not up to something. And to some extent, it may be the quiet ones that are up to the worst stuff. And that's a little bit like with these lubricants. The wet lube is great at masking the issue, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's better in that scenario. So I think certainly from what we tell our athletes, and we've tested this, and we've done a ton of work with the lab at Purdue, is that the savings over those first hours until wax breaks down, in those hard conditions are significant. And if you then want to add something, you can actually end up in a significantly better place, both from a frictional terms, but also from a chain wear perspective. I mean, it's, there are tests you can do where, you literally can take out a chain in a couple 100 kilometers, with the wrong lube and dust combination. And so starting with the immersive wax guarantees that you're at least getting those first, whatever. If it's harsh off-road, it's probably 3 to 4 hours. If it's gravel, it's probably a couple 100K. And then if you're doing the Unbound XL 350, either swap your chain or then move to wet lube, and effectively you're starting at kilometer 250 with a wet lube chain that has had zero wear and super low friction for those first 200K. And now you're just going to finish the last couple hundred, on this wet lube chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said, though, about that mental marginal gain for the athlete who's trying to ride fast or trying to go flag to flag without stopping and faffing and messing around with their chain. Achieving that could mean quite a bit, right? I mean, that's ultimately the point here, and I guess that's why we keep bringing this up, is how can I have it both? How can I have both worlds without doing anything, right? That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. I mean, realistically, you can't. If it's all about the mental marginal gain of not having the noise, then you really just need to start and run with the wet lube, and then you just have to pretend that you're not riding this ever increasing friction ramp that is grinding away at the inside of your chain. And like I said, we make a wet lube, Synergetic. It's the far and away winner of wet lubes in the zero friction test. But if you look at it in dry, dusty performance and in wet, muddy performance, I mean, it beats all the other wet lubes, but it's still nowhere near as good as wax and those are 300 kilometer intervals. The big difference being the amount of noise, the perception of effectiveness. So I would say if you're under, that, I mean, really Adam's testing is all done with 300K lube intervals. And so I would say 300, but you know, in really harsh conditions, you start to hear your wax chain at more like 200. You know, if the noise and the mental anguish is too much for you, then I really would just go with a wet lube and buy the best wet lube you can buy and use it properly, but also be aware that it is what it is.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you know, I know there's a handful of companies now really actively developing in this category. You know, I mean, it's kind of exciting for me. I mean, we're in a bit of an arms race, I think, if we're honest, right? You've got us, you've got Rex in Finland, who are just lovely folks, and we actually trade emails and chat quite occasionally, and Ceramic Speed, who are also good friends of mine. You know, you've got these three companies really aggressively developing around in this space around this topic, right? Like, okay, what's the fastest? What's the lowest wearing? What's the longest single application? And I think, you know, we're still at that phase where, you know, there's hundreds of types of waxes, and so there's still all this experimentation to happen, and then there's hundreds of different additives, and so you know, we're not yet converging on a kind of a single solution, nor is it exactly yet like a continuum where you just have to pick like longer single app versus lower friction versus you can still probably have your cake and eat it too up to some point. But I think, you know, particularly with the types of events a lot of our listeners do and a lot of the types of events that are popular right now, I mean, these are just extreme events. And so, you know, when you add all of that complexity, you know, I'm going to do Unbound XL and it's going to be dry and dusty for half of it, and then it's going to be rainy and muddy for half of it. Well, you know, shit, man, that's really hard, and you probably need a couple of solutions there. And, you know, at the same time, though, we don't want to make it like Formula One where, you know, every whatever, you know, 15 degrees temperature difference, you need a different tire compound. And I think, you know, if the tire engineers had their way, there would be, you know, there'd be 12 compounds.
Don't mention Formula One on the show now. Be careful.
Right. You could certainly make an argument that you could do a lot with 12 compounds. And I think even as, you know, you see talking F1, you know, it's worth the time lost to make the pit stop to get the right tire.
Sure it is.
Or to get the new tire. And I think that's probably the maybe the change that needs to come, especially for supported races. I mean, if you're at Unbound and, you know, there are aid stations and things, I mean, you know, my God, the benefit of picking up a brand new chain, if you can do it or have somebody do it, you know, for you in 10 or 15 seconds, the benefit to that is way bigger than 10 or 15 seconds, especially if you were going to stop anyway for water, right? Now, the benefit isn't enough that, you know, if you're the lead group of professionals, you know, I wouldn't say drop out of that group to swap a chain, right? Because you'll never catch back on. The gains don't match, but yeah, I think we're definitely just at that spot where, I mean, the stuff now is so much better than it's ever been, but there's still hard choices to be made.
Have you tried any of the? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Fatty.
Sure. So a practical real-life follow-up on that. From my last weekend, I was racing mountain bikes in Fruita, Colorado and on a course called the Sarlacc Attack Adventure Fest, which is fantastic high mountain desert single track until in the final, say, 10 miles of the race, it dumps you into a wash, which is normally dry, but this spring has had a high runoff, and so I alternated for the last, say, for the final 5 to 7 miles between riding in water and riding in sand.
Terrible. Yeah,
this
that's
is,
just
now,
terrible.
I was running Synergetic, okay, and you know that's my lube of choice, just because I'm way lazier than Hottie. It's easy to apply, and but after, you know, 2 dunkings followed by, you know, grinding through truly, you know, beach quality sand, the noise was extraordinary. Many of us at the end, at the finish line, were talking about how we expected chains to explode any second. Would there have been any value of, once I came out of the wash for the last time and I was going to be back on single track for the final few miles, would there have been any value besides just for my own sanity, to do a quick couple of rotations or an application of lube? Or at that point, is it just like, well, too late, damage is done, get to the finish line and clean it for real then?
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely would be an advantage from a chain longevity and friction to do, because you think of the lube as you apply it over a lube chain is flushing stuff out, and that is one of the things that Adam's tests for. You think of like that step, what is it, phase 2, where he's basically pouring sand on the drivetrain as it runs,
right?
And then when you're adding lube, it's flushing some of that out, and then similarly in the wet phase and the step 6, the worst one, where it's a mix of water and sand. How well does the lube keep that from getting in, and then how well does a reapplication of the lube help get that out? The situation you describe, if you had a freshly waxed chain, it could probably handle alternating wet and sand for an hour or so without anything, right? And any grinding you hear is going to be external between, say, chain roller and cassette and cog, but the inside of the chain is going to be completely clean and happy because it's full of wax. None of that stuff is getting in. And so I think that's the other thing to think about is, the wax starts to break down after longer distances and starts to make more noise, but there are differences between like internal noise and external noise. And so, yeah, you probably with a wet lube probably had more external noise and probably the beginnings of some internal breakdown because those things can get into that. But yeah, that's the kind of scenario that hot melt wax in particular, but even the drip wax really does fine with towards the beginning of its life, right? It's only after you've sufficiently broken that down that it begins to struggle later on. And that, like I said, that's why we say, hey, start with this. It's going to be there's nothing that can touch it for the first whatever, call it 200K, and then make that transition to wet where you're just backfilling. And unfortunately, there's just no drip wax technology that dries quickly enough to have a similar effect.
Yeah.
But there are a number of other ways you could, you could slice that. I mean, at some point, probably, in an ideal world, a pit stop might be like a quick flush with like an aerosol lubricant, right, and then a good lubricant over top of it or something. But that's we don't live in that F1 pit stop world.
But you're making what is a pretty good argument for the kinds of racing that I do. Of course, there's a few very long distance races I do every year, but mid-season I'm doing races like I did last weekend, 35 to 40 miles, mountain bike in highly varying conditions. Sandstone, single track, going through a lot of water crossings just because of amazing runoff, and of course, various amounts of loose sand. Sounds like I need to sort of overcome my inherent laziness and make an investment in learning how to do and use a wax setup.
I would agree. I mean, what you're describing is exactly, that is the ideal and perfect hot wax chain scenario.
Alrighty, Hottie, move over here. Come over to Utah. I got some work for you.
Happy to do it for you, man. But all my pots and my Instant Pots here, and so you got to get them changed.
I'll buy whatever
you need. Get
some
chains to me, or just buy some off Josh. He's got freshly waxed chains, and then all you got to do is redunk them when they're ready to go. Boy, it sounds like you were riding on the moon there, Fatty. In fact, NASA is dealing with a dust problem that will make our little issues here on Earth look like nothing. Like, of all the problems, they're trying to go back to the moon, obviously, and of all the issues they're dealing with, the cold, the lack of atmospheric pressure, the radiation, the biggie is dust. Like, the dust on the moon is nasty, nasty stuff, and you're talking about landing rockets and having them take off from the moon and blowing that dust all over the place. And the dust is, it's described as like very fine, very sharp, and it grinds up everything. So if we ever want to do our hour record on the moon, which we talked about before, we better know how to keep our chains and bearings from being ground to a pulp by moon dust. So there's something here, Josh. I think there is, by keeping the dust at bay.
Oh God, that actually, my head hurts thinking about how hard a problem that is to solve. Right? Think like raw materials that work in space, right? Because it's that the environment there, the temperature swings, the lack of any air pressure. Man, that's hard stuff. And I will say, Mars rover uses our high velocity spray applied tungsten. That's essentially the bushing technology in the wheels of the Mars rovers. Doesn't solve the dust problem really, but it does solve the grease and bearing and a bunch of other problems. So, yeah, we have that technology today because it was developed for Mars rover technology 30, 40 years ago. So hopefully whatever they're doing today to solve these problems on the moon end up in our world. Hopefully less than 40 years from now.
Love it. We have been to F1, to the moon, to Mars, and have spent many enjoyable minutes in Hottie's chain spot this episode. Let's call it a show. That's over to you, Hottie.
Okay. But just because we still got a lot of questions in queue doesn't mean we don't want to hear your newer ones. And here's how you get your question to the top of the pile. Text or call the Marginal Gains hotline, 317-343-4506. Again, not for Fatty because he has the phone number memorized already. It's 317-343-4506. You can also comment on this or any episode at marginalgainspodcast.cc, which is where you'll see links to all the platforms for listening to this show.
And we'll be back soon with more questions. We'll be back soon with more questions, but will we have answers? Well, it depends. Thanks again for listening to Marginal Gains.